guys, welcome back. So today I wanted to jump back into the world of preserving. Many of you guys have been requesting I do more videos on this. And now that the garden is really slowing down, I'm having more time to jump into my stew and soup recipes. I personally like to call this recipe like pot roast in a jar because it literally tastes like you've been making the best pot roast of your life in a crock pot all day, but it's already ready to go for you when you want it. I love the convenience of canning, so I figured I would go ahead and give you guys this recipe. This is one I've already made once, I think like maybe 6 to 8 weeks ago. We've already ate through that entire batch because it's really just great if you're not feeling like cooking to go grab a jar, heat it up, and you've had a great home-cooked meal. This recipe is from the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving. If you're interested in canning or if you are a canner and don't have this book, highly suggest it. It gives you everything you need to know in a million recipes in this book alone. I swear not a million, but there's a lot of recipes and there's a lot of really good ones that I have done so far, and definitely highly suggest. I will leave a link to this in my description box down below. This is a pressure canning recipe, so be warned, you will need a pressure canner, but don't be intimidated because this recipe is so simple that it's a staple probably for the rest of my life. I will probably continue to make this for the rest of my life. So one thing I want to point out before we get started is I will have timestamps down below that you can go ahead and jump to the recipe, but I wanted just to add like a little disclaimer, even though there's not really a disclaimer, but I do know some of you guys have been following me since the days I was vegan. I was vegan for a few years, and I also preach sustainability, so it might come as a shock to some of you that I am making a beef recipe. But hear me out. So our friends over at VanLeeuwen Family Farms, they are where we have sourced our beef, and they are amazing. They are really doing biodiversity and sustainable practices, all organic, pasture raised. They are really doing everything that needs to be done. Through the years of my research of industrial farming is the problem. Cattle are not the problem. They can actually do really great things for pastures, and the more I was researching through the years, I really realized that meat wasn't the problem. And I also had a handful of health problems due to not having enough protein in my diet for multiple years and all that jazz, but I won't get into that. I wanted to give them a shout out though because they are doing things right. And if you want to eat meat, the best thing you can do is support a farmer that is really doing a great job. So I will make sure I link their YouTube channel and their website down below in the description box as well. I do believe that they can ship all across Kansas. Don't count me on that, but I believe that is something that they can do as of now. So either way, I will have them linked below, and let's go ahead and jump in. All right, so if you do have this book, this recipe is on page 409 if you would like to follow along. So you will have some prep work in this recipe, but once the prep work is done, really it's smooth sailing from there. You'll need 12 cups of peeled and chopped potatoes, 8 cups of peeled and chopped carrots, 3 cups of celery, 3 cups of onions. Pretty simple, but when you're peeling and chopping vegetables, it can take a little bit of time. One little hack I have for this is if you ever have extra carrots when you buy like a bag of carrots, or even potatoes for that matter, or onions from a recipe, go ahead and chop those things up and throw them in a freezer bag, and then you already have chopped vegetables ready. You will notice I actually added chopped celery and a handful of also chopped carrots from my freezer in this recipe. It's completely fine to do so, and it also saves you a lot of time and money, so those things don't go to waste. So once all the vegetables are done, I go ahead and unpack all the beef. This recipe does call for 4 to 5 pounds of beef. I'm using 4 pounds today, and one reason I love stew meat, especially for this recipe after all the chopping we have done, is you don't have any prep work for the stew meat. It's already chopped for you. So before cooking the recipe, once everything is prepped, I like to go ahead and get things prepped and ready to go as far as the jars are concerned. I get one of my really big stock pots and start heating up jars. You will notice I have a glass top stovetop. You cannot pressure can on these. I actually have a whole camp stove that you guys will see in a minute. I also find that camp stove really handy because if you've never pressure canned before, it's kind of a loud process. And if you're doing things when it's still kind of warm outside, is also handy just to have it outside because canning takes some time and you don't want to heat up your entire house. So now that everything is prepped and ready to go, I go ahead and brown all the beef. I add a little bit of oil to the pan and add the beef kind of in section since we are working with so many pounds of beef. You just want to brown the beef. You don't want to fully cook it all the way through. You are going to be processing and also boiling this stuff throughout the process. So you just want to brown it. It's only going to add a little bit of flavor, and it's also going to get a little bit of that extra fat out that we really don't need into the cans. So once browned, I go ahead and transfer to one of my other stock pots with all of the veggies in it. Then the only thing you do after that is add water to cover. This will create the stock, and once the water is added, I add 1 teaspoon of thyme, a half teaspoon of pepper, and 4 teaspoons of salt. So normally I would opt out of salt in recipes because we tend to do things a little bit lower sodium in this house, but for a recipe like this that calls for salt and doesn't claim it as being optional, especially when it comes to meat, I go ahead and add it. So now that everything is in the stock pot, we wait for this to come to a boil, and you do want to stir frequently while doing so, just so things can continue to heat up very evenly. So while doing that, I like to get all of my canning materials ready to go. I like to use this silicone rack with a towel over it to place my jars so heat doesn't transfer onto my counters. I also have jar tongs, a debubbler, and a jar funnel. All of this comes in a set that I will also link down below for you guys. I have all my lids and rings clean and ready to go, and then I also add 3 inches of water to my pressure canner. So all pressure canners will be different, and you do want to see what your pressure canner states in the manual instructions. I have an all-American pressure canner, which is pretty standard for us in the US, but just double check before you do anything further. You want to add that water before the jars. Just a little FYI. So now that our stew is boiling, it's time to fill the jars. One thing that's important to note here is that when you are pressure canning, you want to allow 1 inch of headspace. And what that simply means is 1 inch from the top of the jar here. One reason for that being is because when pressure canning happens, there is a lot of expansion, and if you go over that 1 inch of headroom, you can have some fallout or some bubble over, and that can also kind of mess up the seal of your jar. I did actually have one jar I probably filled a little bit too high up, probably just barely. I did have a little bit of spill out, but definitely not much. This was the only jar that happened to. If this does happen to you, make sure that the lid is completely on there just by doing this little check here. There is no concern for the liquid fallout. So FYI, if the jar is completely sealed and good, you're good to go if you made that mistake. So I take my hot jars out one at a time, ladle the stew in the jar, debubble, and then measure for that 1 inch of headspace. If I need to add any more stew at that time, I will. After filling the jar, I will wipe off the rim of the jar with a wet cloth and vinegar. This will help remove any excess oil that might be on the rim, which can also mess up your seal throughout time. So I repeat this process until all the jars are filled. This recipe actually does state that it makes 7 quarts over here. Every time I've made this recipe, I've had a little bit of extra. I kind of just treat it as like my reward for canning all day. I have a little snack where I just save it in the fridge for later. So once my pressure canner is completely full with the hot jars, I will go ahead and carefully maneuver it outside to my camp stove. So once I get everything onto the camp stove, I will make sure that the jars are still placed evenly throughout the canner, and then I will put my lid onto the pressure canner. I place everything on medium heat, and then we will wait for the vent steam to be going for 10 minutes continuously. So you will see this steam happen. Again, you want to wait 10 minutes fully for that steam just to keep going. Once that steam happens for 10 minutes, go ahead and put your weighted gauge on, which looks like, where's my weighted gauge? Looks like this. So you will have little markings that say 5, 10, and 15. Where I live, I have to do 15 pounds of pressure, but check accordingly because everyone is different on what type of level you need a pressure at. Most manuals or quick Google search will tell you what you need to know. So once we place the weighted gauge onto the vent steam, we need to wait for it to come up to pressure before we do our processing time. So once it gets up to 15 pounds of pressure for me, that is when I start my 90-minute timer. So once 90 minutes is up, you'll want to turn off the heat and let the pressure canner naturally go back down to 0. Once 0, I take the gauge off and let any more release escape that needs to happen. So once all the steam has stopped, I will bring my pressure canner inside and open up the lid. You want to open up the lid away from you just for any extra steam that might escape. So once the lid is open, I let the jar sit in for another 10 minutes inside the pressure canner. This is mostly because you don't want to expose your jars too fast to a normal temperature, or there is a possibility that they will crack. So after that 10 minutes, I place onto my silicone rack again with a towel, and that's just again so the heat won't transfer, and that's where I let them sit overnight. Once morning comes, I actually like to take a wet cloth with a little bit of vinegar on it, wipe down all the jars, especially because if you do have a jar that has a little bit of fallout, they might feel a little greasy to the touch, and you don't want to have any type of residue on the jar. I mean, that could just create problems during storage time. Then I date everything, take off the rings, and that's it. I have jars of stew ready to go for my convenience. If you guys like this video, I will make sure I link my pressure canning chicken soup recipe. Those two are pretty much staples in this house. I also like to just pressure can a bunch of chicken broth because homemade chicken broth is a whole other level than store-bought chicken broth. But if you're getting into canning and pressure canning, definitely don't be overwhelmed by the world of pressure canning. I know I was for a while there just because there's so many warnings and step-by-steps you need to follow. But again, it is pretty simple, and I hope me showing you this really easy beef stew recipe will give you the confidence to do so. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will see you guys all next week. Bye!